Hi, stat students. Welcome to our first set of notes for our distance learning experience. Today we are going to be talking about Chapter 10, which is Observational Studies and Experiments. Some of you might be more comfortable if I call this 3.10. Remember, we just spent a couple days on 3.9. You guys had taken a quiz the last time that I saw you. I did grade those and put those in Schoology before I left school. So those are in there for you. But we are now moving on to section 310, which is all about observational studies and experiments. Your learning intentions for this section are learning the difference between an observational study and an experiment, as well as how to conduct such studies. Your success criteria: you can confidently differentiate between an observational study and an experiment. You can draw or describe an experimental design. You know the necessary aspects of an experiment and what is needed in order for the experiment to be successful and ethical. And you understand the benefits of blinding and blocking, as well as using them within an experiment. Okay, so we're going to jump on into it. I am going to break these notes up into a couple different videos, so you might notice that there's a couple shorter videos on here instead of one long video. I'm doing that in case you're struggling with your attention span. I know we're all kind of in different environments here, so you're welcome to pause as needed with these shorter videos, and I did kind of break them up so you get a little break in between some concepts. The first thing we're going to talk about is an observational study. Just like normal in statistics, as you guys are familiar, but at this point, today's a lot of vocabulary and not a ton of actual math, but we will get through it together. So the first thing is observational study. In an observational study, you're just observing people. That's really it. You're observing people and seeing kind of how they behave. So one example of a relevant observational study might be a grocery store employee observing customers as the store opens in the morning to kind of see which products are the first to go. That way they can effectively strategize how to purchase those products so they have more the next time around. So that would be an observational study. We're just observing our sample to see what's up, you know? The next thing is a retrospective study. So it's an observational study where we're looking at previous conditions or behaviors. So sometimes we look at historical data. The thing to be careful with that is historical data can have errors, as sometimes note-taking and mathematics and all kinds of that stuff can be slightly off. They don't have to be random samples in a retrospective study. You can just use whatever data you have. But we want to usually focus on estimating the differences between variables. And finally, a prospective study is you're looking at the future. There's no treatments. You're just looking at, like, observing people in the future to see kind of how they behave in the future. So, for example, designing an observational study in early 2007, a larger than usual number of cats and dogs developed kidney failure. Many died. Initially, researchers didn't know why, so they used an observational study to investigate. Suppose you were called on to plan a study seeking the cause of this problem. Would you want to design a retrospective or a prospective study, and explain why? So you're told a bunch of animals potentially have this kidney failure, and it's causing them to live shorter lives than they typically would. So your textbook recommends a retrospective observational study. So that's where we're looking in the past. We want to know, we want to survey all pets, or we can't survey all pets, I'm sorry, because that would be a census, right? And we talked about what censuses are in our last section, 3.9. But instead, to make sense of all these kinds of things, we would look back at our historical data and look at maybe some cause and effect relationships, look at the animals' diets, their environments, all kinds of things to determine if there's any sort of link between their kidney failure and their environment around them. So observational studies help you discover trends and possible relationships, but we cannot determine cause and effect relationships from observational studies because who knows what's causing things, right? So we can say that we can determine relationships, but we cannot do cause and effect relationships. Alrighty, the next thing we want to do is, or we want to talk about, is comparative experiments. So comparative experiments allow you to actually do cause and effect relationships. The experiment has at least one explanatory variable called a factor to manipulate and one response variable to measure. So one example of this is an experiment. And in an experiment, you are manipulating a factor. Like, let's say you come up with a vaccine. So the factor that you're manipulating is giving people a vaccine. You're randomly assigning subjects, to those treatment levels. So your groups have to be random in order for you to determine that the experiment actually works. The samples or the subjects in each group have to be random. And then you compare the response of the subject across treatment levels. So you typically have an experimental group and a control group, and you want to see if there's any sort of difference between the experiment that you performed and just how nature works itself out. So in an experiment, the experimenter manipulates factors to control the details of the experiment, but subjects are assigned randomly. We compare responses from the different groups. And just like I said before, the subjects are sometimes called experimental units. When they're humans, they're called subjects or participants. And we want to look at factors or levels of the factor of the experiment. And a treatment is a combination of specific levels from all the factors that an experiment unit receives. So let's say you want to see how isolation affects a person's health. You might look at a couple things. You might look at like their overall well-being. You might look at their medical health, like if they're sick or healthy. You might look at their mental health. You might look at their social life and those aspects. So your treatment for people might have a combination of all these different factors in it. So an example of this, determining treatments and response variables. In 2007, deaths of a large number of pets, dogs, and cats were ultimately traced to contamination of the brand of pet food. The manufacturer now claims that the food is safe, but before it can be released, obviously we want to test it because nobody wants anything bad to happen to their pet. So, in an experiment to test whether the food is now safe for dogs to eat, which would be the treatments and which would be the response variable. So our treatment is going to be giving, we need to have at least two groups, right? We need an experimental group and a control group. We're going to want to give one group of pets this food that we're not sure if it's safe, and we're going to give another group of pets food that we for sure know is safe. And then we would have, so those would be our treatments, and our response would be our veterinarian's assessment of the health of those animals. I'm going to pause our notes here because it's been a little bit, and you can pick up when you're ready on our next video that's posted on YouTube.